This podcast should not be used as a substitute for medical or mental health advice. Individuals are advised to seek independent medical advice, counseling, and/or therapy from a healthcare professional with respect to any medical condition, mental health issue, or health inquiry, including matters discussed on this podcast. This episode discusses abuse, which may be triggering to some people. The views and opinions expressed are solely those of the podcast author or individuals participating in the podcast and do not represent the opinions of Red Table Talk Productions, iHeartMedia, or their employees.
I think because I had forgiven so much, he received that as permission. And so he was continuing to act out as long as I think he could keep it secret from me. But I look back on that is when I started to really begin to empower myself and take ownership and not self-betray anymore.
Has the narcissistic person in your life ever been enabled by the church? So what do you do when you are married to a narcissistic person, throw in some sex addiction, but you are part of a church that extols forgiveness, supporting your husband no matter what, and your feelings just don't matter? We are about to hear one woman's experience of growing up in a family that was about keeping emotions quiet and devoting yourself to the church. Then being love-bombed, marrying young, being betrayed, and having to navigate the complex waters of religious enablers who embolden her husband's acting out. When you throw religion into the mix, narcissistic relationships get a hell of a lot more complicated. In this episode, we are not using the name or identifying our guest in order to protect her and her family. Let's listen to her story. I want to thank you so much for being here and sharing this story because it is such an important topic and it hits themes that might be some of the most difficult for survivors. So again, thank you so much for the gift of your time. I'm really, really grateful.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Ramani.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
So your story is so fascinating to me. Let's start from the beginning and let's start about how a relationship can be impacted by a church. I think that it's almost like, forgive me for being crude, you were like in a threesome with a church. The church just kept being really intrusive and getting involved in your relationship in a way it should not have.
I've never thought of it that way, but there definitely was a triangle going on, like lots of triangulation in the relationship. Absolutely, 100%.
Can you lay us out a framework about how you and your husband met in Bible college, and what originally attracted you to him?
Yeah, we met. He was a year younger than I was, and he came onto the scene and was super charismatic and a leader, and everyone loved him and loved his family. And so we were really brought together by this vision, I think, for ministry and doing tons of good in the world. He served people. He was great with kids. He was great with people of other cultures. He was great with people of all ages and just really loving them and serving them. And that was so attractive to me. I think I wanted to do good in the world too and be involved in ministry. And I think in the Bible Belt in the Midwest, in order to do that as a female, I had it in my head that I needed to attach myself to a man. So to be a pastor's wife was such a noble calling, and he was the guy on our campus. And so we connected, and he was very charming, and we were really this like power couple. People would call us that. He was great on a stage, and I was really smart and could come alongside him and serve. And I think even in that role, my job was to be his helpmate, right? So to come alongside him and serve him and help him be successful. And even when he got his first ministry job, people would say it was a 2-for-1 done deal. He was the pastor and I was the wife coming on who could serve and be involved and help. And I was also had really strong leadership capabilities. And I was an educator. And so I was really good with students as well. So him as a youth minister. So we were just this power couple together for doing good in the world. We were very young when we got married. I was 22, he was 21. But that's what you do at Bible college in the Midwest. It's like a ring by spring or your MRS degree, like it's a joke. So I needed to make sure that happened. I didn't want to leave college being alone and locked that in. And we were on our way to do mission in the world together.
As soon as I hear charm and charisma, you know that alarm signal you hear in movies? It's almost instantaneous for me because you said you talk so much about charm and charisma, but your 20 or 21-year-old self would not have known that, just like most people's 20 or 21-year-old selves. And yet, it's such a tough one, right? Not all charm and charisma always leads down a narcissistic or a toxic pathway, but a lot of it does. But it's the opposite of a red flag. In fact, for many people, it's engaging. But based on the story you were sharing, I had a couple of questions. Where did you get that message? Because you were as committed to this idea of ministry and the goodness you could do through your commitment to religion. Where did you get the message that as a woman that you really could only actualize that if you were attached to a man? The term power couple is something we often hear being used to describe people in narcissistic relationships. I sometimes wonder if it's a way for the narcissist to sell the idea that together you are doing something powerful. But my experience, it's code for one person gets to be out there and get all the glory, and the other is meant to support that. And the term, I guess it's designed to make you feel like you share the power with them. But in a narcissistic relationship, you never do.
I think that was just a story that I grew up in the church that I was a part of. And it was the men who had leadership roles and women were the wives not to the side, like they were very active, but just not in the leadership roles. I remember even when we both had graduated with ministry degrees, I had even graduated with a bit more as I had an education degree from a secular university. And he was moving into his pastor's job after graduating and being ordained. And I had requested to be ordained as well, because I was like, I want to do ministry with my life also. And I was told no. Oh. So they ordained him, but not me, because I was a female and most likely I would have kids and then not be doing ministry anymore. And I could never be a lead pastor of a church. And so there was like an explicit, I think, conversation with me of like there was a limit as to what I could do in leadership and in service because I was female and married. So it really was this, if I want to do what I want to do in the world, then I need to attach myself to this man. And I wanted to attach myself then to somebody who I think I saw was going to be successful in that and do a lot of really good things in ministry. I think to some extent it worked for me too. I think I was intimidated by carrying a lot of the responsibility of leadership and insecure in myself. There was this, by attaching myself to somebody else who carried that, the charm, the charisma, the confidence, I was attaching myself to that. And so I could lead from the shadows. And that worked for me a little bit also.
So was your family also like a missionary family and very committed to the church?
They were very, very committed. And I'm really grateful for what I was raised in and really good values and serving the world. And then my parents were both educators. And so lots of volunteering. Like it was church and school. And so they gave their life, I think, to serving kids and families and then in the church. So I was raised in this world of service and wanting to make the world a better place, which is a really good thing.
Yeah, it is.
And I'm really grateful for that. I think the shift for me that I look back and I see now was the communal narcissism that played into that, of that by serving people, that is what makes us important or great. But yeah, my family was very much like that too.
Okay. All right. So they must have liked him.
They loved him.
Oh, okay. So all these things are making it one thing on top of the other is making it harder.
Yes. I mean, everybody loved him.
Wow.
I was the difficult one because I would see things and not put up with things. I saw things in our family that weren't working. I'm more like the stereotypical role of a scapegoat. And so I think to some extent, even by finding this person who everyone loved, where I had felt like the scapegoat in a lot of ways growing up, now I was attaching myself to someone who almost like by proxy, I could be loved too, because everybody loved him so much and accepted him so much. And he was so good around people. But yeah, my family loved him. He became like the third child of our family. And it actually really helped our family dynamics because he was super fun. And so that took a lot of pressure off in our family. Like it was really great to have him around.
Did you like his family?
I did at first. So his family was very beloved in the Christian college campus that we were in. They had gone to that school as well. I did, because I think that I saw in them what was missing in my family. So he had a really great relationship with his mom, and they were in ministry as well. And so I think I saw in them like this really great family, and I wanted to escape, I think, from my family of origin in a lot of ways. And so it was like, oh, I'm going to marry this guy who has these really great values and who's really wonderful and comes from this really great family. At least what I saw at first on the surface was just this ideal of what I was missing, I guess. So yeah, at first I really loved, and they were from a different country. And so there was like a romantic piece of that. So yeah, there were a lot of things that I loved about his family.
Did they like you?
That's a great question. I think they did because of what I could do for him. And I needed to be a helpmate to him. So as long as I was supporting him and serving him and being a very good wife, then I was acceptable. What created conflict was when I began to step into my own leadership. It was not acceptable for me to supersede him in any way. So there was almost like a competition. And so I needed to be in my place and be his really good pastor's wife, which I rebelled against a little bit in like small little ways. And so that began to create conflict. And then the further we got into the relationship and the more that I realized the dysfunction and the codependency, and I would speak up, the more conflict that created and created more and more boundaries because he was very enmeshed with them. And I don't think that I realized that beforehand. And so as a wife, I'm like, no, like leave and cleave. So we're like, you're here. And so we need to set boundaries. And I would very much assert myself in that way. And that didn't go over well. Like he was, I feel like brought in as a third child into my family and just beloved, but I was always his wife.
I see. So that's a role in a way. And it sounds as though they wanted you to step into that role of, I don't know, being his cheerleader?
Cheerleader, yes, but in a very like codependent way, as if like the cheerleaders were out on a field helping the players like win the game.
So what I'm hearing, to make sure I'm clear, his family, potentially the whole church, people around you, expected you to be fully subjugated to him.
Yeah, they did, but with a weird like nuance to it of like enter into your calling, lead and things, but not so much that it would supersede him. So it's like be great, but not too great.
Right, but the part be great, don't be too great, and also take care of all of his needs.
Yes, do all of that.
Do all of that.
Do all of that.
Right?
Yes.
And not have a need.
No. And if I did, I needed to like fix that myself because you're right, it was all about his needs.
Narcissistic relationships are solo acts, and the rest of us are at best backup singers. In her story, it seemed like everyone was in on that. His family, her family, the church, all supported this idea of him being front and center, which made it harder for her But this is every narcissistic relationship. There just isn't room for more than one person on their stage. It definitely is, at best, sort of a supporting role.
Yeah, yes.
I would even say you were sort of like a really involved extra in this play. It was very much, like you said, you all existed to keep him front and center. I want to go back to the beginning of your relationship, because you've described him as charming and charismatic and a leader, and everybody loved him and he was beloved. But what was the very beginning of your relationship like? I understood what you saw in him, but what was actually the day in and day out early on, even when you just first met?
Going back and thinking about it now, knowing what I know, I see all sorts of things. And so when we first started to get together, there was a strong emphasis on being like physical with each other and coming from a very conservative Christian space. That should have been a red flag, but I justified it, and I had been in a very long relationship in high school, and so it just felt very normal, I think. But I look back now, and that wasn't in alignment, I think, with on the outside saying who, I guess, as a pastor and certain things like that, our relationship existed very much in the public realm. So we didn't spend a whole lot of time together one-on-one. So not a lot of dates, just us. And I think for me, I justified that there were a lot of couples where we were and people getting very serious very fast. And so people would ditch all their friends and just cling to each other. And so there was almost even like, we're better than all the other couples because look, we still hang out with everybody. But I look back now and it was because the relationship was empty. There wasn't an intimacy there. There wasn't a lot of talking. So it really was about who we were publicly and who he was publicly. And when your relationship is based on this mission to other people, then that makes sense. So our relationship was in public, doing mission trips together, being involved in just things together out in the world, but not a whole lot of just us. Or we would go like back to my parents' house for the weekend and come back and I wouldn't hear from him for a few days because it was like, we just spent all weekend together. Why do we need to talk? And I'm like, we're dating. We have a serious relationship. Or he would do trips and wouldn't contact me or things. But I think I just justify as like, oh, he's 100% where he is. I had a story for everything. And I love that about him. I love that he is just 100% where he is. So when he was at camp or doing different things, he was just 100% where he was. And so that's okay that he didn't connect with me or reach back out to me. So I made a lot of excuses, I think, to justify the behavior.
The justification now sounds like you know more. That is part of sort of a trauma-bonded relationship. You're also very young. But you raise something here, though, which is around the issue of narrative. And I talk a lot about this when it comes to narcissistic relationships. These relationships get to stay alive because of the stories we tell ourselves about them. So you crafted it into not only a plausible story, but a really, really healthy story. You know, as though he's very present and connected, rather than viewing it as a real lapse in intimacy. And in a way, he almost needed a group to be in a relationship with because an individual can't bring that much narcissistic supply. But you wouldn't know that. Most people wouldn't know that. And in fact, I think your intelligence almost strangely got the best of you because you were framing it as, well, all these other people, they're moving so fast, they're pairing off like, nobody's business. And look at us, we're evolved. We're able to actually have this relationship and not do this sort of simple thing of pairing off and not seeing that as an issue with intimacy, which obviously would then come back, I'd imagine, throughout the relationship.
Yeah. And in fact, I think coming from my family of origin and being the scapegoat, I continued that narrative in a lot of ways too. So in the relationship, I was the one who had the dysfunction. I was the one who was controlling or irritable. Like I took on, and he was just so healthy because he was so great and had all of these great relationships.
But you did think he was a great husband in the beginning.
I did. And then the parts that weren't, I think I just attributed to youth. And thought, oh, he'll grow up. We're getting married young, like you do. And then you're going to grow up together. And my parents got married when they were like 20. And so, yeah, you grow up together. So I think I thought, like, the things that weren't okay, it was like, well, that makes sense. Like, he's a 21-year-old. Now I'm like, a boy. Like I have a 17-year-old son. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I think that those things, I just thought that he would grow out of them. Like even some of the narcissistic stuff is like, he's a 21-year-old guy. He'll learn how to adult. We'll grow out of these things together. But I think back to when we were first married, and we were married on this small little Christian college campus. And so we were surrounded by community and very involved in each other's lives. Like we weren't separate. Like it just felt so good and so right. And he was a great dad at the beginning as far as being really involved with the baby and very hands-on and really great with kids. And yeah, like it just all, and everybody thought like we were great and this perfect little family. And yeah, we were adorable.
You just said something so interesting. You said he was only 21 and the behavior he was engaging in was youthful. And I have to say, you're absolutely right. If you were sitting here across from me and said, I have a 21-year-old son, and my 20-year-old son's behavior is blah, 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 entitled, slovenly, impulsive, the whole list. You know what I'd be telling you? I'd be saying, personality needs a minute to develop, emerging adulthood, frontal lobe, blah, blah, blah. And I'd say, call me when he's 25. So why would we hold you to a different standard because you're his wife? Does that make sense? So that one is so striking to me because it's young to get married, though it wasn't young in the world you were in, right? To get married at 20, 21, 22 is actually really normative in a Bible college, is what you're saying. So I think that we want to be so careful because it's so easy to just sort of cross arms and say, oh, couldn't she's charming and charismatic. You shouldn't have had a second date. Says no one ever. And then you're writing his behavior off to youth. Any parent would be doing that. I actually think there was a certain wisdom to your young self to be able to say, well, he's young. You're right. 21 is adolescence. We may not think of it in society, but as far as your brain is concerned, you're still an adolescent, especially a boy, especially a man. And so I think to me is that your story is fascinating in that way because like, oh, red flags and all this other stuff. And you're even saying here you became young parents and early on, he was an attentive father. So whatever red flags they were getting eclipsed by all of the other stuff that was good. And then this huge looming voice of the church, which is telling you you're in something great.
Yeah. In fact, my kids now, they're like, why did you marry him? Like, how, you know, it's like, it wasn't like this. Like, you look back, but it wasn't. It was young love. But there was, I think, something in my gut that was noticing things that were off or that weren't right. But I think that I thought, what I want to say is like that I could fix it. I know that you can't fix another person, but what I haven't mentioned, like there was a sex addiction that was there as well. And so, you know, a pastor that looks at porn but I think even that, it was like, well, like that's a normal guy thing. So that happens. And so I think even that, it was like, I'm willing to walk with you through that. But there were all of these things that I saw things that weren't okay, but I wanted the relationship so bad. I was willing to overlook it. I wanted the love. I wanted what he was telling me that we could have and what could be. And so we crafted this really beautiful vision together. And I think I was willing to go through whatever I needed to go through to grow into making that happen.
That right there, though, that's the statement. I wanted this relationship so bad. And the wanting it so bad, if there was ever a sort of a moment in any kind of toxic relationship, it's that, right? Because that automatically almost becomes a curtain that gets drawn over your eyes so you can't see the red flags, or like glasses that just turn the red flags into not red flags kind of thing. But you just don't, you want it and you're young and everyone's telling you it's great. That's a lot to push against. But you just dropped a bit of a bomb into the conversation. You talk about sex addiction. Okay, so I'm having a lot of thoughts as I hear you say that. Number one is, I can't imagine that sex addiction was ever going to be viewed in any kind of benevolent lens by a church. Like a pastor watching porn, that doesn't seem like a good brand.
No. However, this like triangle of the church was very forgiving to him. And when something would come up or he would get caught. There was one significant time in college, and the leadership forgave him very quickly. And I think it was, oh, you made a mistake. This is a struggle. You need to get help. And he was like, I'm sorry. And so we even broke up for a time because I was like, this isn't okay. And we ended up getting back together in the context of ministry because he was just very sorry, and he said the right things that he needed to say. And he would say he wasn't even being honest about the extent of it. So there was no way that I could have known how deep that went for him until much later when more stuff continued to happen. But like, yes, that's not okay. And the church loves a recovery story. And the recovery stories are beautiful. So then what happened was we became this like, we're going to be the recovery story. And we became the recovery couple. And that was another place for, I think, him to get more narcissistic supply, really, because the affirmation then came of, look at how well he's recovering. And I was the wife who stood by her man and who forgave, and we were leading a recovery ministry at a church. And so it moved. So we actually took this sex addiction where that could have potentially cost him his job or been bad. We reframed it and repositioned it to now we're going to use our story in order to be able to help other couples in recovery.
We will be right back with this conversation. Whose idea was it to sort of shift the narrative over to we're the recovery couple?
Probably both of ours together. I think he got involved in recovery, and because he's so charismatic, anytime he steps into somewhere, people are going to move him forward into leadership, whether or not he demonstrates the ability to be able to carry the weight of that, he just would get put into those positions. And so as he then stepped into that, again, I'm the good wife, so I'm going to come alongside. And so I began to support him. And I was going through my own stuff. And so it was like, well, I can enter into recovery too. So I can talk about my family of origin. And at that time, also, I was having repeated miscarriages. And we never found out why. And there's a piece of me that will always wonder if my body just knew from fear not to procreate with this human anymore, because they never found out why. But so I entered in like my own recovery. And I think that the other piece of recovery is all about owning your side of the street. And so when you think about it, the family system, then I needed to work my 12 steps. I needed to work my stuff. I needed to own my character defects. I needed to own my codependency. I needed to own my part that I was playing into the system, my need to control, my, addiction. If addiction is all about shame, then I needed to own how maybe I was shaming him. And so I think the recovery, like me working my stuff became like what I could focus on because that's what I could control, I think, in order to alleviate my fear. And then he was supposed to be working his stuff too.
How did the church find out? Because I understand that you found out that he was watching something, okay? You lived in the same home as him. That's not remarkable. How did the church find out that he was engaging in chronic habitual pornography use?
We were in a master's program with a church. And so when he confessed that to me, I think for me, it is not appropriate for you to be doing this and be in this program. And I value the character of the church. Like I wasn't going to be like a co-conspirator in the hypocrisy. I think I grew up around and seeing a lot of hypocrisy. And so I think that there was like, we're not going to do this. We're going to be honest. We are going to be honest about what is going on. And so that brought to the leaders of the program. And so I think for him, it's like either he's this like failure of the program or we turn this ship around and become the recovery people.
How did he respond when you said to him, you need to come clean? If we're going to be in this master's program that is still affiliated with pastoral study and all of that, how did you bring him around? Because I'm just wondering, did that not bring up a lot of shame for him that you're basically saying this, you're doing a bad thing, and it's a bad thing that you need to own up to, or we are, then, like you said, you're being a co-conspirator. So how did he respond to that?
He was okay with it because I think that was the first time that he didn't get caught. It was a confession on his part to me. And so I think I know as I think about it, I think that there was something in him that like either didn't want that, wanted to be well, wanted to recover. And so I think that was like, this is how I'm going to get help. So I do think that there was a piece of that. But I think as soon as he found out, that was going to get him attention too, because then everybody surrounded him as the addict. So that's when that started too. So I think it was a way of getting more, now looking back, more narcissistic supply. So he got a ton of compassion. He got a ton of support. The church really rallied around him. The group really rallied around him. And now that I see the pattern throughout, nobody really surrounded me. I don't know if it come across as very strong and capable. And so I think like she has it. Look at how strong she is. Like I still continued leading in my way and supporting him. But I think it all became him. So it really worked for him actually to confess because he got attention, he got support from men who then wanted to mentor him. And yeah, it really worked actually.
But what's interesting to me is that's a real lack of empathy and compassion because for you, you've experienced a betrayal in your relationship. You're a new mom, you're young. And so it was all about him and his struggle, but nobody was saying, are you okay? Because this is a big revelation to unearth about someone. And in a way that you're saying that, is it conceivable that I might have had these repeated miscarriages because of this? You were under tremendous stress. I mean, there was a real split in your life. You wanted your marriage to work. You believed in it. You felt spiritually committed to it. And you were with somebody who had betrayed your trust, and you didn't know if you could trust him, and you didn't even feel like you knew who he was. When we have to live in those inconsistent ways, it's incredibly stressful. And so now he actually steps into it. He owns it. He may have, like you said, he may not have had a choice. I mean, listen, I'm going to sound really cynical when I say this, but I wonder all this entire community of men who embraced him, I don't know what the hell they were doing at home, but how much his public shame became a place for them almost to adhere to as a place to almost manage their own shame. It becomes this really sort of strange coalesced shame system, if you will, that he is now getting validation, which I think it's a whole projection thing too, that they have their own shameful stuff. So he gets to be the repository of it. But even though if it was that, he was still getting validation. He was getting attention.
100%. He got a ton of attention. I didn't feel like I could be angry. I didn't feel like I could be like in that betrayal, like any type of boundaries. I feel like I would have set like they were mean. And so I didn't feel like I could even have my own emotional experience because that would have been very like disrespectful. As like I'm supposed to respect my husband. I'm supposed to honor my husband. So to be angry and bitter and resentful, I think it was like, I'm not going to be that. And so it was, I'm going to embrace the forgiving and coming alongside of him and supporting him in recovery. So I think like, I don't even remember really even getting angry. It was just like, I think into triage mode of like, how do I save my marriage? How do I save the image?
So you were basically being told, not just by your, I guess maybe your husband, but the entire system around you, you're not allowed to have your own emotions, which is the ultimate gaslight. I mean, you were collectively gaslighted by a system that said you had no right to your feelings. You will feel the way we think you should feel. And the only way to keep your life going was to kind of buy into what they're telling you could feel, which didn't include anger. The woman scorned is one of the most dangerous sorts of tropes that is out there, because what it does is it's a way to literally say to half the population, you don't get to be angry, you don't get to feel betrayed when you've been betrayed. And so by painting it as woman scorned and saying that a woman scorned is such an unattractive trope, it's a way of effectively shutting down half the population. honestly, I think an angry woman is an incredibly attractive state to be in, because when a person says, I'm angry, I'm having a feeling, it's an ownership of emotion. It's an ownership of an experience. So, hey, all you women scorned out there, unite, because there's an army for you. As a woman scorned in the past myself, I really felt, I agree with that. You really do feel as though if you show that, somehow you violated some sort of social code. And so I think that's a really important piece that folks understand. That was gaslighting. You weren't allowed to have reality. You weren't allowed to have a real emotional experience.
No, which I think then kept me in it and kept me blind to a lot of things leading into the addiction while we were in recovery, using recovery as a shield in order to act out more, and for that acting out to get more and more significant. So in 2015 is when I found out that he had been for like 3 years acting out with people while we were leading the recovery ministry. So I had no idea. And I think that is when that was the breaking point for me, as far as I broke. I don't know if I broke to make a powerful decision. That came later. But as far as really, I think, this is really significant. And I don't know what is going on. I don't know what is true, what is not true. The cognitive dissonance was incredibly significant at that point. And that even then, I held back the anger. So the sad was okay, but the anger, I still felt I felt wrong about being angry. I felt guilty about actually acknowledging that this wasn't okay. So the trauma was fine. I think me losing my mind a little bit was okay. The fear was fine. The sad was fine. But the anger, I needed to hold it to the side again, because it became about him and his recovery and saving our marriage.
Where do you think you got that message that anger was bad? Do you think that was only something that evolved over the course of this difficult marriage, or is it something you were raised with?
Oh, definitely something that I was raised with. It was okay for my mom to be angry, but it was not okay for me to be angry. I think that my mom probably has some narcissistic tendencies, and so her emotions trump the house. And so I wasn't allowed to feel, definitely couldn't be mad at her. So I remember one of the things that I would say all the time growing up is give other people the benefit of the doubt.
Okay, so I have said this. I said it on Red Table. I said benefit of the doubt are the four most dangerous words in the English language, because what happens is the empathic individual is always offering up the benefit of the doubt. That allows the people who are causing all kinds of havoc to keep getting that benefit. And we are encouraged to give people the benefit of the doubt by existing institutions and structures, most famously things like the church, right? Give them the benefit of the doubt, give them the benefit of the doubt. But the challenge is no one was giving you the benefit of the doubt because you weren't allowed to be angry.
My job was to forgive. And I think even with my husband, forgiveness played in so huge to that. Part of being the supportive wife was my job to forgive and to accept. And I remember the Valentine's Day that we were engaged, I had stayed up that whole night and had made this chain of really nice things. There was a piece of paper and there was a nice thing on every piece of paper. And I made this huge long chain from Valentine's Day up until our wedding date. So there was a thing for every day. And I had stayed up all night making it. And he did nothing for me for Valentine's Day. We were engaged and he didn't do anything for me for Valentine's Day. And I remember even in that, it was okay, I given him my the chain, I was so proud of it. And then he was thanks, and received it. And there was nothing. And I remember Lane was I'm sad. I'm going to let myself be sad. I'm going to let myself be sad. And so then he came over and I was you didn't do anything. It's Valentine's Day and we're engaged and you did nothing. And it was almost he didn't even realize that was a thing. And then it was I'm sorry. And then it was are you going to do anything to make it right? And we had a very explicit conversation around, I just needed to forgive. That there wasn't anything that he needed to do to make it right, because in this lesson here, I needed to learn to forgive in order for us to have a successful marriage. I needed to forgive him. And so I remember even thinking, this is me being noble. This is me being strong. This is me having character to forgive and to move forward. And so like there still wasn't, we had issues throughout about Valentine's Day throughout our marriage. And it was like a story that we would tell. And even then in our recovery journey, it was a story we would tell. And I would tell it about, look at how good I was at forgiving. I was a good wife, man.
That whole idea of pathologizing every human want and every human emotion you had from the beginning meant that you were almost in a setup here that all relationships were really going to be your entire emotional world could not exist. Like you were sort of housed underneath them and you served. Your function was to be there as your mother expected you to be. Your function was to be there as your husband expected you to be. You jumped from that role to the next one and you simply had to forgive. In a way, I think any narcissistic relationship is a process of what I'd call forgiveness grooming. They test the waters. They say if they can play this game of forgiveness with you. And once they recognize forgiveness is on the table, they're off to the races and they're fully emboldened. So that's why I call it grooming, because it's a process. I'm going to do some small things. And for him, that Valentine's Day that you still remember, all roads of validation are one-way streets in the narcissistic world, and they all lead to them, right? There's nothing going back out. But some of those early things were early forgiveness tests. And so when they forgiveness groom and they're like, okay, I've got it. And I always say this, that forgiveness is really giving the narcissistic person, they view it as permission. They don't view it as a divine gift. Because I really do think when forgiveness is given in its purest way and accepted in its purest way, it's like, wow, this person not only has empathy, but they have now given me an opportunity to be better. And that if you're on the receiving end of forgiveness, you do better. At a minimum, you never commit the original transgression again. Or you're very quick to say, I'm talking about big ticket stuff. I'm not talking about keeping the toilet seat up stuff. I'm talking about big stuff that you commit yourself into say, somebody granted me this divine gift of forgiveness. No. For the narcissistic person, you're like, yo, they forgave me. I'm off to the races. I can do anything I want in this relationship. And then I'm going to weaponize the forgiveness. And not only do we see even narcissistic people who are not in religious systems, not in churches and whatnot, weaponize forgiveness. If you then have the emboldening hordes of validators behind him, which he did, literally like you almost could view them as flying monkeys of a sort, but saying, you're entitled to this forgiveness just because, then he really did think he could do anything he wanted.
So we took a year off for significant recovery and we engaged in all of that. I was like, I'm going to do whatever I need to do the right thing by this marriage and forgive. But along in that granting the forgiveness, I think it actually empowered me in a way. I began to feel like stronger in myself and take ownership, I think, of some of my life and not self-betray anymore. And so then the stronger that I became and then not giving up on myself, then that's, I think, when our relationship stopped being able to work.
Correct.
Right? So I did start doing the work on myself. I think that was a catalyst to, I need to do some work here. So even all of the Wives of Sex Addicts material, it's like coming into your own and my own 12-step stuff, and really did begin to do my own recovery. And I started building a career and empowering myself. And I think that's then when I became very frustrated in the relationship because I wasn't self-betraying and I wasn't going to give up on myself. And so then we started having a lot of conflict and misalignment. And I think because I had forgiven so much, he received that as permission. And so he was continuing to act out as long as I think he could keep it secret from me. But I look back on that is when I started to really begin to empower myself and take ownership and not self-betray anymore.
I love that, because when you started engaging in a path of self-recovery, of focusing on yourself, because the entire sort of recovery power couple trope was all focused on him and his recovery. But you stepped up and were reading these materials and going through these programs and say, this applies to me too. I mean, if we want to view it through an addiction model, we could stretch it a little and say there was an addiction to being a part of something like this, to being part of this, to being part of this marriage that was being valued and as being these people who are sort of these models in the recovery community. But you became individuated as you completely became more and more aligned with yourself. That's the moment at which the narcissistic relationship no longer works. It's over then. It is absolutely over. And it can escalate. It can get angry. It can get dangerous. Sometimes it can even get violent. And people can get ostracized and everyone will say, you're no good. You were in a church community. I'm sure they didn't view this very well in you. So everyone's going to put you out. But that's the path forward to healing. You just didn't know that because it doesn't seem like you were using the framework of narcissism at that point. There's two things I want to get to. One thing you said really struck me was that, again, as part of the work of recovery, I'm very aware that it's this idea of taking ownership of your quote-unquote character defects, right? Did he?
Publicly, he would say all the right things. So yes, like he did. My oldest son was looking at pictures, like he's such a shapeshifter. Like he just could shapeshift to wherever. And so he could learn the language of recovery and learn what he needed to confess and what the character defects were. And so did he acknowledge them? 100%. Did he do any work to change them? No, he would acknowledge it, but not necessarily do anything about it.
Someone once said to me, insight is the booby prize if it's not met with action, right? If somebody says, here's all my insights, I'm like, okay, so then change the behavior. Without the behavior change, it's worth nothing. I can say this as a therapist. My client could sit there and go on and on and on. I get it. But if they come back the next week and said, well, I did all the same things I did, then I said, then what is that? So in a way, what he was doing was performative recovery. So it was, I'm putting on the show that people want to hear and following the program, as it were, and all of that, as 12-step would have you do. But he was continuing to engage in the behavior. And your son's observation, such an interesting one too, just even as a teaching point, in the sense that he said his father is a shapeshifter, right? Narcissistic people are very shape-shifty. All toxic people are shape-shifty because they want one thing and one thing only, which is validation. So they're going to be whatever they need to be. They're going to mirror whatever they need to mirror in a given sort of an environment so that they can get that validation. It's sort of a process of emulation. They become what they need to become. They say what they need to say. So everything they say is superficial. It's a sort of a superficial preaching of scripture. They will say what they need to say to get the parishioners really worked out, but they actually don't necessarily live in accordance with that. And that in the recovery space, he was beginning to learn if you say X, Y, and Z in this space. And it's sad because I would imagine many of the other people he was speaking to may have been genuinely committed to recovery. And they were falling for this huckster, basically, sort of a recovery huckster who was up there and preaching really the non-truth, which ultimately, if they find out, the other people who are in recovery, that's a betrayal to them as well. It speaks to how little empathy he had. May I ask, were you seeing sort of pastoral or Christian therapists?
The therapists that we were seeing are couples therapists. She was a part of a church. And so I think that's when I really began to realize this idolization almost of family and marriage. Yeah. And so even like the talk around, your marriage comes first before your kids. Like you need to have a solid marriage so that the kids feel safe and secure in the marriage. The unity of that, and I think in a healthy situation, that's important to cultivate that relationship in the context of family. But there was like this idolization almost to where then there would be a toleration of things that was really that were really toxic. And I think even in that and seeing his patterns and how he was showing up and then how he was showing up with the kids, the older that they got and the more that they were experiencing him and maybe not feeling so safe and seeing the hypocrisy and seeing the lying and the disingenuous, like in there, I raised them to be very empowered and to speak their mind. And so they created a lot of conflict between him and his kids. And so there was this moment was like, okay, this isn't going to change. This is how it's going to be. If I take marriage off of the idolizing it and really look at, is this healthy for me? No. Is this going to be healthy for my kids? No. And at this point now, we're just continuing the generational cycles. Like, it's like, oh, this is how this keeps going. And I've been in enough 12-step rooms to see and hear people talk about their kids. And it's like, no, like this isn't going to be, that's not going to be my story. And so I need to do something different, which I look back now and just how courageous that was to step away from people who I value, like I respected so much, and to have the courage to say, no, this actually doesn't work for me, and we're going to end this.
It's incredibly courageous because to step away from the sort of toxic, confusing, gaslighted, manipulative mess of a narcissistic relationship is difficult on any day. But when you have an entire organization enabling and emboldening this person, you know that you're going to have to face down their disapproval. Since you were a child, ministry was important to you. This was core to who you were philosophically and spiritually. This wasn't just about breaking up a marriage in a strange way. It was breaking up with your conception of God. That's really big. And so to do that, you actually did something that I hope for all survivors. You found a true north, and your true north were your children. You said, I am not repeating these intergenerational cycles. And it takes that because you saw how much easier it would have been to keep it the way it was. You broke out of that path because there was something bigger than you. And for once in your family system, instead of making it about these ephemeral ideas of marriage and faith and family, you made it about your living, breathing children. That's how people break the cycles of narcissistic relationships. Our session will continue after this break. So you make the decision. You're going to do, again, I can't say enough how courageous it was. You decide to leave. What did that look like?
We were on a vacation, just the two of us, and I found out that he was still continuing to look at pornography after everything that we had been through. And not just that, but he was continuing to lie about it. And so I think for me at that point, it wasn't necessarily about the sex addiction. It was the lying. It was that he could look me in the eye and tell me an untruth. And I don't know how to continue a relationship with that when you can't trust the person who you are partnering with for life to be honest. It was very significant to me, and I asked him to leave. I think another piece was that I began talking to people who were completely removed from our situation. So I got some really wise counsel, and they connected me with some people who lead a marriage ministry at a very large church in another part of the country. And so I had a lot of respect for their experience. And they were like, no, this is not okay. You need to empower yourself, and ask him to leave. And we separated bank accounts, and they really encouraged me to, I think, make things difficult for him so that he could make the choice, like he would need to choose. And during that time of separation, he continued to violate boundaries. He continued to not tell the truth. He didn't show up for the kids. He continued to make it about him. So he would go on these men's retreats. He would go on because he needed to be around wise people and good people pouring into him while I'm left alone working a full-time job and with a 10 and 13-year-old, basically raising them at that point all on my own. And it was like, oh, he doesn't really want it. he doesn't. He's not willing to do the work. I know what the work looks like. And so it just became clear this is what I need to do. And I asked for divorce. And that it was like, do you think that this is what God wants? You told me, you vowed that you would never divorce me. You're going back on your commitment. I was like, I am. And someone's like, yes, that is what I'm doing. And it was like, the kids are always going to know that you were the one who decided this. I'm like, I'm actually cool with that. So he turned it back on me. I think I had done so much work, and I was, I think, expecting those arguments. And so it was all right. And then even in the whole divorce process, it's very different, I think, from a normal narcissist, because he didn't fight me on anything. He didn't want custody. He didn't even fight me on stuff. Like, he left, but he like left in such a way where I was the one who was making all the decisions. So I was the one who was deciding that this is what was happening and this is what, this was ending. And he began very quickly after we were married, which the boys, we were married for over 17 years. And so I think that that was very hard for my kids. And he didn't understand that they were still working their process. There was no empathy towards them. So I think how he had been treating me for years, then it began treating the children that way. And that became not okay. And so I think they had grown up seeing how, me repeatedly go back and go back and go back and go back. And they want something different for themselves too. So then they made the choice that they didn't want to see him anymore. He continued to make choices. I asked for full custody. And he fought it a little bit because I think therapists were like, you don't want to give her full custody. Don't do that. But I knew he wanted his freedom. And so it's like, you can have your freedom. You can do what you want. You can marry whoever you want, move wherever you want. And I actually want to raise kids. So, and he willingly just signed the papers. So I have 100% legal and physical custody. So he just gave it all up.
Again, you did something that I think is a really interesting, it's something for everyone to pay attention to. He hit you with all these shaming, manipulative pieces. You did something interesting. You were steadfast. You're like, yep, I'm breaking my vows. Okay, I guess God's going to be mad. You were just like, okay. You didn't let yourself get gaslighted at that moment. I am convinced that when you did that, he was done because there was no path inward. None of the portals of manipulation were open anymore. And you were no longer an interesting source of validation and narcissistic supply. Your supply became uninteresting at that point. So, as you said, then he couldn't do it to the kids either. So none of you are supply. He started dating right away because he was going to get more supply. And when we look at the sex addiction model, one of the things we do see is that there's an impairment in intimacy. And we see this in narcissism too. There's no capacity for mutual, reciprocal, loving relationships that are sustained and have depth. They do not have interest. For a narcissistic person, a relationship is just a source of validation and admiration. And so moving on to a new one is actually quite easy for them because it never went deep in the first place. So how do you fit spirituality and church into your life now?
Yeah, it's been a little complicated. And I think I'm allowing myself the journey. And so I think that there is a reconnecting to God and my higher power from an individual, right? So as a very personal place, what does he have to say about me and to me and his love for me, not focusing on love for the addict and right, and how I need to forgive, but for me. And I think William, what does he want for me? And to be free from toxic relationships and free from abuse. And I'm still figuring out stuff with the church. I love the church. I love community and I love hope. And I do love forgiveness and grace. So still on a journey, I think, figuring that out.
I think that all healthy relationships are about mutual recognition, and any relationship with any human being, or honestly, any relationship with God, has to be one of mutual recognition, and that it can be tricky, that in many cases, people can turn God into an enabler. But I do think that if you can hold space and say, I will only be in relationships characterized by mutual recognition, then people can craft that kind of relationship with a higher power, with whatever sort of spiritual North Star they're navigating by. And I think that's a huge part of healing from narcissistic abuse. And you speak about redemption, and I think that for me, that the redemption story in narcissistic abuse, and the mistake people have been making for the longest time is on the redemption of the narcissist. Frankly, I have little interest in the redemption of the narcissist. Too much harm's been done. I believe wholeheartedly, though, in the redemption of the survivor. Because I think many survivors blame themselves. They blame themselves. How did I not see this? How did I get stuck for so long? Why did I put up with this? How did I contribute? How was I responsible? Maybe I didn't forgive enough. Redemption then becomes letting go of that. You showed up. You showed up as a good, empathic, forgiving person who wanted to be there for that person. And that the redemption is then to set yourself free and then to stand in your power and to say, you can gaslight, manipulate me, fool me, trick me, and charisma me all you want. I'm out. I'm not doing this anymore. You talked about your son had pointed out, I think dad's a shapeshifter. How did your children make sense of their father's behavior, especially since he dropped out of their lives?
So in the marriage, because we were so involved in recovery world, they spent hours sitting outside a therapist's office. They have spent hours in childcare at recovery meetings. They were usually aware that anytime a woman was over at our house with kids, that usually her husband had done something that wasn't okay. They were aware of the things, and my son had found his journal that had talked about the massage parlors and things. And so 10 years old, explaining that to him. So they were aware. They knew that I lost my main basically in 2015. And so they had, a front row seat really to seeing recovery and to seeing me forgive and seeing me stay. And then they saw him continue to not show up. And so I think they made their own decisions. And I talked to my oldest, and he said it's the financial piece that spoke out most to him. Like that his dad wasn't like a hard worker and like a provider, and that really affected him. And then just not being a good role model as a man. And so they said, Dad, this is what we need in order to be around you. We need you to go to therapy. We need for you to go to your 12-step, and we need you to be single. Like, you just screwed up a marriage. Please get yourself together. Like, they wanted him to do well, and he refused to do those things because the narcissistic supply was coming from other women and her children and things, and that became just very clear. So I think they feel very safe and secure in the home that I can provide. Like they know that he's going to make his choices. And I think they're like, as we're still forming our identity, we don't want to be around that crazy. We see how you treat people that you say you love. So you go and do that. And maybe in the future, as adults, we can have a very shallow relationship. One time, my oldest, we were talking, and he was just talking about his own grief with his dad. And he was saying, I feel like I have a phantom leg. Like when you lose a leg and you feel like you have a leg. He's like, because I have a dad, but I don't have a dad.
Wow.
And I was like, yeah, it's kind of like that. He's like, but I got a really strong other leg. And I was like, yeah, this other leg's really tired.
Your son is a bit of a genius, because one thing that a lot of people may not know about phantom limb, unless they've had a phantom limb, is that the phantom limb hurts. And so people with phantom limb syndrome, amputees, have pain. So there's no arm, and they feel the pain in that space, in that leg. So your son saying he had a phantom father, he was still experiencing the pain of that invalidating father. Her son says something so profound and interesting here, characterizing his relationship with his father to having a phantom leg. Phantom limb syndrome is a very real medical phenomenon which occurs in people who have lost a limb to amputation. And despite the limb no longer being there, the person still feels real pain as though the limb was still there, and that can be very distressing and uncomfortable. Her son is saying, I still have two parents in the world, but not only does one no longer really exist in my life, like he says, it's like a phantom leg, I still feel grief. Just like a phantom leg, you still feel the pain even when the limb isn't there. And even a prosthetic isn't a cure. the pain remains. I'd never heard of that kind of characterization before, but it really does capture that complicated and lingering grief that many people, particularly children who are survivors of narcissistic parents, will often express.
Yeah, we're still experiencing the pain. I mean, the other thing that he said about the phantom leg is he was like, you can get a prosthetic. Because I've been encouraging them to like make relationships with other men. But to your point, like that pain is still there. And you can't see it. And I think that that's the hard thing of explaining with community. I think people are like, come on, like get out there, start dating and you're good now and like move on. And I appreciate it so much. But there's a pain that people can't see, and the trauma bonding and the betrayal bond, like it's real. And I'm still working, I think, through a lot of that, and my kids working through their grief. So we are, like, I feel like we're doing our best to try to create something new, and we are, and moving forward. But it's taking us a minute, or like the pain is just still there. I love that about the phantom leg or the
it
limb.
Still hurts. It hurts still, and that's a big issue in treatment, actually, in amputees. So in a way, it's a retraining, which is what recovery is. And I think that ultimately, though, by this story, the whole idea of performative recovery is a very real process. I have worked with many people who've lived with substance use disorders, with other forms of addictive disorders, addictive behavior. When people commit to the process of recovery in a whole way, in an authentic way, in an empathic way, and in that recognition of all of us have human frailty, I've seen amazing things happen. Narcissism is almost a complete block against recovery because there's no humility. There's only grandiosity. It is still about ego. When there's ego, there cannot be recovery in that way. And so I think that this is, to want listeners to know, I very much believe in the process of recovery from addiction, but I got to tell you, when narcissism's on board, forget about it. It muddies the waters in a way that I have not seen. All I see is just a lifetime history of not only relapse, but also harm to other people who are often viewed as the vessels of blame for that person's incapacity to actually step up and take responsibility. So I can't thank you enough. Your story is just profound. And your story is also interesting because religious communities, the church in many ways, let you down, but then it didn't. Because in the same breath, there were people within the church and areas of the church that told you, get out, save yourself, take care of yourself, you deserve better. It's easy to paint something as big as the church as doing only bad. Parts of the church did bad, but parts of the church did good. And I think that's important for people in spiritual communities to realize that their faith matters to them as part of their healing, and they may just have to find a different path within it that works for them, and to recognize that there can be bad actors anywhere in this world, even under the sort of mantle of the divine. So thank you for opening up about how varied that process was for you too.
Thank you so much for having me.
Here are some takeaways from my conversation with today's guest. In this story, we learn that when a person is struggling in a toxic relationship, they may feel okay with sadness or fear, but not with anger. In narcissistic relationships, people are often uncomfortable with their own anger, and it is often judged quite harshly, especially if there are other forces like family or systems like churches involved. Anger, done right, can be a profound motivator and can take us out of a passive role into a more active one. If you are in a toxic relationship, let that anger fuel you to make decisions that protect you instead of always protecting the narcissistic person. In our next takeaway, remember to be very wary when you view yourself as a branded couple. They went from being the leadership couple to the recovery couple. And we have heard of people calling themselves the power couple, right? This stance often works for the validation seeker and means that the individuals in the relationship get lost. So then people often find themselves fighting for the brand of the relationship rather than clearly seeing the red flags that are popping up everywhere. In this next takeaway, let's remember that forgiveness is the paradox of the narcissistic relationship, and unfortunately is what propels the narcissistic relationship forward. It harms you, helps them, and is encouraged by the world at large. The toxic folks keep doing manipulative and entitled things. The other person feels they don't have a right to their feelings and that they are being a bad person for not forgiving. So you forgive, and the patterns perpetuate. The more you forgive, the more toxic a narcissistic relationship gets. This story teaches us that when that day comes, for whatever reason it comes, when you start doing your own work on yourself, start finding yourself as an individual with needs and feelings separate from the relationship, and start silencing the voices of the enablers, that's the day the relationship will start to unravel. The rules of engagement in a narcissistic relationship are that all validation is for them. They are entitled to do and say what they want. Your personhood doesn't matter, and how dare you think otherwise. When those rules start getting violated, they will fight you, manipulate you, look for new supply, or just leave. Narcissistic people are very prone to something we can call performative recovery. Recovery from addictive or other unhealthy behavior just to get validation. It may look like recovery to the world, who is cheering the person on, but it's pseudo-recovery, and the person may still not only be continuing to engage in the addictive or problematic behavior, but also continue to do harm to those closest to them, all the while being cheered on from the recovery brigade. If you are continuing to be harmed by a relationship, even if they suggest you have to stay in the name of their recovery is their responsibility. And it's an inside job, not just to get validation from the world. Hey everyone, so I've been welcoming hearing your emails, and I have one that somebody sent in. So let me read this one to you. This person asks, "Hi, I'm growing up with a narcissistic mother, to say the least, and being abused. I'd love to explore those family dynamics, especially that of the truth teller, or the knower, and the impacts that has on a daughter." So first of all, thanks everyone for listening, and thank you for sending in your questions. This is such an important question. It's so funny because everyone says, oh, aren't all narcissists men? Well, obviously not, because a lot of folks have narcissistic mothers. And it's one of the most difficult relationships a person can have. And frankly, I think it's really profound for a daughter, because we grow up with this idea that a mother is supposed to have our back like nobody else. It's supposed to be unconditional love, caregiving, that person who is all about us and just wants best for us. So when a person starts to recognize that their mother actually isn't at all that, and only will notice you when you're sort of in service to them, that's a really heartbreaking moment. Now, the person writing this email self-identifies as what we call a truth teller. The truth teller is the child in the narcissistic system who kind of gets it. Like, even from a pretty young age, they may not know the word narcissist, but there's something with the look in their eyes that they give their parent or parents or family system that in a way the narcissistic person almost feels unmasked. And as a result, there's a real likelihood that that truth-telling child can also often become a scapegoated child within that family. So in terms of the impacts, certainly in childhood, the impacts can be really quite harrowing. The child often self-blaming for what's happening, often almost doubting, even though their insights are on point, they start to almost get indoctrinated into doubting themselves, and also having a lot of fear because they get it. They know that they'll often bear the brunt of the punishment or the rejection or the negation. And kids coming out of these environments, including truth-telling kids, often feel like they're not enough. And that kind of thinking, that sort of identity, can definitely trail a person into adulthood. So it undercuts your sense of self. It undercuts your self-evaluation. It undercuts what you think you can be in the world. As you go into adulthood, you can easily see how having had an invalidating, emotionally abusive, rejecting, and critical mother can set you up for entering this cycle again and again of entering into relationships where sort of rejection and invalidation is almost normalized. Narcissistic parents, especially mothers, can be quite tricky because there can be some really great days or moments, and you almost hoard them like little trinkets you put in a box. Like you want to collect as many as you can, because when that happens, you're like, yay, I'm in a normal family. And then before long, it's going to happen that something very invalidating will happen. So you're constantly caught in that back and forth. And there's a risk of recreating those cycles in adult relationships by choosing people who behave in the same way. But there's a bit of good news in this person's question, because they identified as a truth teller. Being a truth teller in a narcissistic system is a really interesting role, because I think ultimately it's a protective role. It's sort of a superpower you're born with. You're able to call BS, or at least see BS when it's happening in front of you from a very early age. If you can hold on to that superpower, that detection, that ability to see toxic behavior when it's in front of you, and carry that into adulthood and not fall back into the patterns of self-doubt, you really have a powerful superpower in this day and age when more and more of us are encountering more and more toxic people. The real trick is to take back your sovereignty, to become someone separate from your mother, to recognize above all else, you were not responsible for your mother's behavior, to be able to detach that and recognize your mother's issues were hers, you are enough, and her treatment of you is not a reflection of you, it's a reflection of how she perceived and continues likely to perceive the world. And I know this topic of narcissistic mothers is compelling for so many of you, so you're really going to be looking forward to the episode we have coming up, where we're going to have someone go into pretty brutal detail about what their relationship was like with a narcissistic mother and how that shaped her trajectory in her career going forward. A big thank you to our executive producers, Jada Pinkett Smith, Fallon Jethro, Ellen Rakieten, and Dr. Ramani Durvasula. And thank you to our producer, Matthew Jones, associate producer, Mara Della Rosa, and consultant, Kelly Ebeling. And finally, thank you to our editors and sound engineers, Devin Donahue and Calvin Bailiff.